Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Salah Goss, and I'm the Senior Vice President and Head of Social Impact in North America for the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. Today's event, Investing in Inclusive Neighborhoods, is part of our 6-event series in partnership with the Social Policy Institute at Washington University in St. Louis and our exceptional local advisory committee who inform the content, speaker, and event design of these conversations. It's wonderful to be in conversation with you today virtually, and I look forward to being in person with many of you soon next week as we continue our events in St. Louis around inclusive growth and closing the racial wealth gap. At the Center for Inclusive Growth, we believe that to really create real impact, the benefits of a growing economy must extend to all segments of society, leaving no one behind. We've learned so much from the past 3 events, and we're really excited to support St. Louis in the creation of inclusive and prosperous economic opportunities for all of its citizens. These are important values to the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, but especially important here in St. Louis, our second home. We intend to be strategic, thoughtful, and inclusive neighbors through our investments in time, talent, and treasure in St. Louis. And that's why today's conversation is so important to us. We hope these events ignite new conversations about the opportunities and challenge of economic growth in St. Louis and empower you to reflect on your role in truly building an inclusive economy. We also want to make sure we amplify the voices of our communities that are already doing work in these spaces, because there's so much great effort and great work taking place in St. Louis already that we must learn from. That being said, we could not do these events without our advisory committee. The Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth and the Social Policy Institute are so grateful to the advisory committee for their efforts in planning these events over the past year. The dedicated and passionate individuals you see listed on the screen right now have connected us to new ideas and new people, and how important is that? And you can find the goals of this event series in the chat right now to see where you might plug in, and we need you to plug in and answer the call for action, because each of you is critical to help us activate change and make real progress. I also wanted to point out that we'll be having a series of events also as part of In Solidarity with St. Louis next week, where we will have in-person meetings and dig into some of the insights that we surface here today. So I look forward to seeing some of you in person very soon. Now, to help us set the stage and intention for today's conversation, I'd like to introduce a member of our fantastic advisory committee, Daphne Moore, to tell you about today's conversation and speakers. Daphne, over to you.
Thank you, Salah. This is the first day of a 2-part conversation about investing in inclusive neighborhoods. We're glad you're here, and we hope you'll be back tomorrow, same time. I'm especially excited about today's conversation because inclusive neighborhoods is how I spend my day as Chief Opportunity Zone Officer for St. Louis. It is my job to attract development and investment in St. Louis neighborhoods. But before we get started with this conversation today, we'd like to hear from you. What do you think are the key elements of a thriving neighborhood? Use the link in the chat to add your thoughts. Today's conversation is more than about what makes neighborhoods great. It's about what makes some neighborhoods great and while others struggle. In the chat, you've named green space, high quality school, services, walkability as some of the things that thriving neighborhoods have. We'll share some of the answers on the screen as they come in. As you look at these responses, why do you think some neighborhoods have the amenities that others don't? That's our conversation for today. When a neighborhood's assets are undervalued, it becomes too costly for developers to invest in those neighborhoods. Without investments, residents miss out on a lot of benefits associated with inclusive and thriving neighborhoods. And neighborhoods with majority Black residents are disproportionately undervalued compared to residents within mostly white neighborhoods. Today, you'll hear evidence of the impact of undervalued neighborhoods using the Inclusive Growth Scorecard from Mastercard. We'll hear from Aaron Thomas, president of Accelerated for America, about the need to revitalize communities by investing in and with communities, as well as you'll hear from a great panel who do this work every day. Investing in neighborhoods is not only about housing, it's about investing in the ecosystem to support residents in the pursuit of their dreams, their goals, and to improve the quality of life. With that being in mind, I would like to pass this conversation over to Matt Lindsay, Global Head of Government and Public Sector Segments at Mastercard Data and Services, to share a little bit about neighborhoods in St. Louis. Matt?
Thank you, Daphne. And it's a pleasure to be with everybody today. As was mentioned, I lead the government and public sector segment in Mastercard's data and analytics organization. We partner closely with Mastercard's philanthropic hub, the Center for Inclusive Growth, in deploying our analytic, insight, and technology capabilities to drive social impact. And so I'd like to share an example of one of these types of tools that we've developed called the Inclusive Growth Score. If you go back to the beginning of the opportunity zone legislation, we saw a tremendous piece of legislation that was offering the opportunity to drive an impact in areas of need. And we also saw the potential for some of that investment to go to places that may not be as impactful for these communities. And so what we wanted to do was put together a solution that would help communities, investors, and associated parties really understand what type of investment would make the biggest impact in a certain opportunity zone. So we put that together, and I'm going to walk through that today, but then something happened along the way. We initially intended to make this available only for opportunity zones in the US, and then we had a global pandemic. And we saw the very urgent need to provide the same side of insight and same pieces of information in a way that would allow for inclusive recovery from the pandemic across all the census tracts of the US. So in the middle of last year, we rallied and made this available for every single census tract in the US. And then we have now also launched it in the UK and are bringing it to additional countries over the next 6 to 12 months. And so what is the Inclusive Growth Score? What we wanted to do was bring together public and private data sets in a way that would help people to understand not only the commercial development of a certain area, but the inclusion of people in that development of local residents. And so what we've developed is a index type of score, 0 to 100 scale, that covers, as the name mentions, both inclusion and growth. And then within those two areas, we broke it down into 3 different components that can drive those measures. And those are place, economy, and community. And then across each one of those, you can see the handful of metrics that we pulled together, in order to see how a certain census tract performs, both at a macro level for an inclusive growth score, but then also where the real interesting pieces come at those subcomponents. So are they better on inclusion or are they better on growth to drive their overall score? Within inclusion, how do they perform from a place-based aspect made up of the metrics that you see on the screen here? How do they perform from an economy standpoint? What that helps to uncover is the way that investment can be directed into a census tract in order to really drive the biggest benefit. So let's bring this to life a little bit with certain areas across the country. We've pulled this together to share with St. Louis. And then I'm also going to share a case study from Erie, Pennsylvania, where you can see this in action. So if we take a look at St. Louis, we went ahead and pulled the inclusive growth score across every single census tract around St. Louis. Now, anybody can do this. If you go to inclusivegrowthscore.com, and I think that'll get placed in the chat, all that's required to register is an email address and a password. I also want to point out that we have now made all of this data downloadable. So one of the first requests we were getting on an ongoing basis was, did we have an API? Could people pull this data into other analyses they were doing? The answer is now yes, as of about a month ago. So you'll see, a tutorial within the website that helps point you to how to pull the information together, but also how you can export it and use it however you see fit. So a quick orientation on this page. This is the inclusive growth score, and this is pulled together for all of St. Louis and the associated census tracts. You'll see across the top of the left-hand side the years that are here. So each individual year, 2017 through 2021, and of course you can compare across years. And you can see, on the middle side of the left, the comparison of the benchmark. Is it across the U.S.? Is it across the state? Is it across other census tracts of similar urbanicity? That's the urban-rural. And so here, this is the macro level inclusive growth score, and you can see the often talked about difference across Del Mar Boulevard. With the census tracts on an overall basis having a higher inclusive growth score south and a lower one on the north side. So that's interesting, but what we find to be more insightful is what are the drivers of that inclusive growth score? What is causing it to be higher to the south, lower to the north? And so you can then break this down by every single metric component that makes up that inclusive growth score and drill down. And I'll give a couple examples here. So on the first one, internet access, you can see that that inclusive growth score component follows the overall inclusive growth score itself. And that you see it performing higher south of Del Mar and lower north of Del Mar. And so that points to some infrastructure needs in North County, and that investment in that would help the overall inclusivity of those census tracts and presents an opportunity. If we then look at the spending patterns, which is part of the Mastercard data set that we bring to bear here in its aggregated and anonymized format, you can see that there's actually a lot more variation across all of St. Louis from a spending pattern standpoint. And so spending growth year over year does not necessarily follow that Del Mar split that we saw in some of the other metrics. So just a couple examples locally in St. Louis of the things that we see. And of course, being able to dive in on each one of the components of the inclusive growth score will provide a very interesting set of insights and help inform where some opportunities for investment might lie. An example of how we're seeing this be used across different constituencies can be in securing investments in underserved communities. It can be building local data assets to help inform and direct different type of investments, or to bolster grant application for funding pools that can be brought into an area. And so a little bit, more of a deeper dive on one such example is in Erie, Pennsylvania. So within Erie, Pennsylvania, in the downtown area, resides the poorest zip code in America. It also happens to be a certified food desert. And so we partnered together with the Erie Downtown Development Corporation in order to take a look at how we can help build the case for private investors and for federal funding for much needed investment in this area. In this instance specifically, they were looking to build the case for a food co-op that would be in the downtown area and serve an unmet need. That is there as noted by the fact that it was a food desert, not strong access to food in grocery stores and so on. However, as you can imagine, making that investment case in an underserved community is a tough one, for a private company to go and invest. And so we worked with the Erie Downtown Development Corps to pull together not only the inclusive growth score, but also spending patterns, source of spending, demonstrating the day-to-day commute of people from the suburbs into the downtown area, and really building up this case that the downtown area needed investment in order to help develop and grow, but also putting a grocery store there would help with, the food desert status. And so a picture of what, this looks like for downtown Erie, you can see that low inclusive growth score in the downtown area, but in the surrounding area, a much higher inclusive growth score, indicating that there is spend that is available to come in and be leveraged in the downtown. And so the result of this, is that Erie was able to build the case to secure an investment from a food co-op that will be building, secure federal funding to support that, and actually has just over the past couple of weeks secured additional funding in order to help this investment. And so just one example of how we see this being put to use in evaluating and directing investment into areas that need it the most. And so with that, I'll wrap up. And I think we've got time, Daphne, for a couple of questions that I'm happy to take now, or at the end of the session as well.
Sounds good. One of the questions I would like to ask, why was it important for Mastercard to put this together so that regular citizens could have access to this information?
Yeah. So, we really believe in place-based economic development and the importance of creating inclusive economies so that everybody can succeed. It's right in line with Mastercard's overall mission of providing financial security and inclusive economies worldwide. And so we wanted to provide something that showed the benefit of combining both public and private sector data sets to drive not only differential decision making, but provide a vehicle to measure the impact of that over time. And so that's really why we wanted to put it together, make it available for anybody to use, but also have year over year comparison available so people can see the impact of what's being done in a community.
And we can put this in report form as well, right?
That's absolutely correct. So you can export it, include it in different types of reports, and that's all functionality that's in the solution itself.
Well, I don't see any questions because you did such an amazing job of explaining this, and I want to thank you again for sharing this information. The information is in the chat of how you can actually play around with this great tool. It is a great resource for communities, and I'm looking forward to using it more and more in the work that we do in St. Louis.
Thank you.
Oh, I have one question. Wait a minute. Don't leave yet. So it said, will you create prediction models using this data?
Yeah, so right now in the tool, there is not prediction models available. We have seen people start to pull it in, into some of their modeling. I will say Mastercard has other data solutions that do incorporate some prediction modeling. And I'd be happy to speak with anybody about that as a follow-up on what some of those capabilities look like.
Okay, thank you again.
My pleasure.
Okay, So now we have the pleasure of our next speaker, who is Aaron Thomas, president of the Accelerator for America, to talk a little bit more about developing unappreciated and undervalued communities by partnering with and investing in the people who live there. Aaron, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Daphne. It's so good to see you. I'm really looking forward to being able to see you in person as well. I know Salah said that, but it'll be really cool to be all together in person. So thank you, Daphne, for the intro. Thank you to the WashU team for putting this together. Sarah in particular, thank you for the hard work. Thank all of you present and listening for taking time out of your day to discuss how to make this country and your city a better place. My name is Aaron Thomas. I am CEO of Accelerator for America. We are a nonprofit organization based in Los Angeles, but we work nationally in scaling, creating and replicating solutions to economic insecurity across the country. I'm really grateful to be here. It's important to say that our work would not be possible without our partners at the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. Obviously, they're not just our hosts today. They are longtime supporters and partners of the Accelerator, and they share our commitment to creating an economy that lifts all communities. So thank you for your support and partnership to the Mastercard Center, and Salah, who of course is here and let us off. I wrote in an op-ed earlier this year in New Cities that trickle-down economic development has failed. The idea that investing capital focused on outside communities potentially moving in and uplifting assets in that way will eventually help low-income communities and communities of color. I think that the idea that if you can afford to stay, you will benefit, and if you can't, good luck, isn't enough. And I think it disproportionately hurts the most vulnerable in the community that it's focused on. Of course, we know that extractive capital is not it. Dollar stores, payday lenders, and the like are all types of parasitic capital that are devastating to communities. I wrote that in the op-ed, and today I want to take a couple seconds to put forth another way in which I think we are looking at economic development in potentially the wrong way. Not because of bad intentions or because we misunderstand the problem, but because the predominant analysis misunderstands how the racial wealth gap that we're all here to mitigate, eventually close, came to be. Obviously, don't get me wrong, the types of folks that attend this type of gathering, that do the work that we do, are really good at understanding what it is and the discriminatory history of this country that created it. And further, I completely understand that the pandemic has been disproportionately painful to small business, particularly Black and Brown-owned business. And I salute and join efforts to support existing businesses and create new entrepreneurs. And of course, we as an organization, along with our partners at Mastercard, are spending a ton of time, energy, and resources creating tools for cities, for leaders, to be able to build out their entrepreneurial ecosystems and foster more Black and Brown-owned business. However, I want to posit to you all that the expectation that entrepreneurship and small business is the leverage point to closing the racial wealth gap, I think it's ahistorical. And so it's my belief that small business and entrepreneurship is downstream, or are downstream, from the economic security and mobility that is afforded by asset ownership, particularly home ownership. We romanticize the mom and pop owned stores of yesteryear. We rightfully focus on the apocalypse for community-owned business that was the coronavirus. But we're spending time, energy, and resources on the Del Mar divide. We've heard it a bunch. I think we're going to continue to hear about it. It's obviously the right focus. I think that we should explicitly acknowledge how the prosperous side of that divide was built. So with, going back almost 100 years at this point, with New Deal policies that fostered economic relief from the Great Depression, combined with the economic efforts that led into World War II and obviously supported the efforts for the Allies. The GI Bill paid mortgages for white veterans and upgraded local institutions, while Black families were obviously left on the sidelines. All the while, the Federal Housing Administration was perpetuating neighborhood segregation, refusing to insure mortgages in and around Black neighborhoods, all the while subsidizing builders who were mass producing entire subdivisions for white families, with the explicit requirement that none of those homes be sold to Black families. I obviously don't have to tell you folks in St. Louis how prosperity was undergirded by industrial jobs, which fostered paths to the middle class and created economic stability. Again, I don't have to tell you that those industrial jobs left And those Black communities that were the last to gain access to that economic engine were also the first ones to lose it. In addition, they didn't have that home ownership. They didn't have the ownership of their communities, and they were redlined out of the most prosperous neighborhoods. And so while Black communities were precluded from the uplift that came with that type of asset appreciation, the asset appreciation that white families enjoyed over generations, or families south of the divide enjoyed over generations, became basically the plurality of wealth in this country. That allows people to pursue entrepreneurship and then build upon that wealth. Those families, predominantly white families, sent their children to college with that home equity wealth. They were able to take care of their parents in old age. They didn't have to depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. And very few, if any, of those advantages accrued to Black families who again were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. Fast forward to today, home equity and retirement accounts account for almost 2/3 of American wealth in this country. So I think that those assets, the assets that again make up 2/3 of wealth in America, came primarily from good jobs and from home ownership. Wealth was built in communities like St. Louis across the country because people had good jobs that paid living wages. They owned assets. That appreciated over time. And I think what I'd like to call for here today is for private, civic, philanthropic capital to focus on the ownership of these communities, especially in the face of economic development and different types of capital coming into them, as we're starting to already see on the north side. So I wrote in this op-ed that it's a lot harder to attract capital that's really focused on the people in these these neighborhoods themselves. But when it actually comes, it will actually catalyze the type of inclusive growth that organizations like Mastercard, like us, that we tout, and it's extremely hard to create. So a couple of examples of this type of investment in neighborhoods that does this. I mean, so there is a product called a mixed income neighborhood trust, built out by an organization called Trust Neighborhoods in Kansas City. There is an organization called Shift Capital in Philadelphia that's doing something called the Kensington Corridor Trust. And what they're doing is owning assets in communities like the north side of St. Louis that one, are not owned by community members, often are owned by predatory outside owners or slumlords or stuff like that. And allocating them and the returns from those assets to community development itself. And so then the capital that comes, whether it's businesses that are started or founded or moving to those places, all of the uplift that comes from that actually accrues to the community itself. And so I guess the future that I'm positing is, what if philanthropies, what if the interested, benevolent kind of folks that are really focusing on cities and Black communities now, especially over the last year or so, funded trusts that accrue directly to the communities themselves, that owned land on the north side, and the private capital alongside that philanthropic capital focus on the development of affordable housing, home ownership, access to mortgages, et cetera, all of the playbook that was run for predominantly white families in 100 years ago and since. We know that there have been programs doing this for generations, but I think what I'm putting forth here today is that what was missing was the ownership and self-determination of the land of predominantly now Black neighborhoods by communities of color, low-income people who in places like St. Louis and others largely did not have ownership of the land and the economic benefits that come with its investment. I think that this type of development and investment would in and of itself foster jobs and native economic development that, of course, combined with a bunch of different programs that people who are here today are doing and building, workforce development, et cetera, ensuring that these type of jobs and this type of investment actually goes to the local communities. I think doing that, then attracting outside investment or companies like Amazon wouldn't have the same fears and concerns that we saw from communities across the country, and what really came to a head in a place like Queens, where they were thinking about doing HQ2 and ended up not working out. I think if the people who come from these communities own the land and the assets that then would appreciate based on this investment, I think it wouldn't be as threatening and concerning. Once we realize economic stability from all those good jobs and access to appreciating assets, I think small business, innovation, and all the wonderful things that we've seen in this country will come too. So I have the utmost confidence that decades from now, these communities would thrive, and the worry that prosperity would accrue to others beyond the community would be nearly mitigated. this, I think, in my definition, our definition as an organization, is what bottom-up economic development looks like. So I wanted to take a few seconds to put that forth, that idea forth. I'm looking forward to disagreements, comments, whatever it might be. Again, I'm really grateful to Wash, you, of course, the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, our very close partners, to you, Daphne, for having me here. And I am open to questions or comments or concerns, or just to turn my camera off and get out of you guys' way. Thank you for having me.
You know, I wanted to do this snap thing. So, you know, talk about Accelerator and the partnership and relationship that is developing in St. Louis, because I think it's important for people to understand that you all are working in St. Louis.
Sure. I think, you know, my focus, sorry, someone's calling me and it popped on my computer. I apologize. So look, so we are an organization based in LA, but we want to support local leaders around the country in fostering the type of development that actually helps communities, like the stuff that I was just talking about. And so our engagement with St. Louis is very much through our partnership with Mastercard. And the way that, you know, you and I, Daphne, got close is because our goal is to bring tools, resources, organizing mechanisms, et cetera, from outside of the community to the community, and help kind of bring the type of, like, you know, we want to support folks like, again, you, Daphne, and your partners, and Neil, and other folks on this call that we're going to be seeing next week that are already doing this work here. We want to augment and support that and bring the right resources around that. And so I think, you know, the thing that we are trying to do here is point the gun that, you know, and, you know, maybe that's the wrong term, but, you know, point all of the resources that people have committed and people are interested in doing, you know, post the death of George Floyd, maybe post Ferguson, post all these things that people are committing. We want to, you know, elevate and support the local developers, local communities, local actors, local organizations that have been doing this work in these neighborhoods for generations. We want that capital and that interest to go to those places. And so my and our interest in St. Louis is getting to know, and this is going to be a lot easier, quote unquote, post-pandemic, even though we're not post-pandemic, even being able to be there in person, we'll be able to, you know, highlight and elevate and hopefully convene the right types of folks, so folks can see the opportunities that folks like you, Daphne, and your partners on the north side have already kind of created for capital to come into. And then, you know, my thesis, and we've talked about this kind of privately, is that if you put the self-determination in the hands of the people that have been leading work in these communities for generations, it's up to them, right? Like it's their own self-determination. And frankly, if they screw it up, that should be theirs to do, right? As opposed to like outside actors coming in and trying to come out with bright new ideas. I think that we should be investing in and focusing on the people that know these places, that come from them, that have the ability to understand what they want and what they need.
Can you think, is there a specific community that you can think about that is really modeling this? I know you mentioned Kansas City, but is there one that we should be looking at to kind of model after?
So I don't want to say Kansas City, only because I think that there's probably a friendly statewide rivalry. So I want to, you know, keep my hands and feet out of that. I'm not trying to step on toes. And my true answer is I don't think there's anybody that's really gotten this right. And I think that, you know, I think that there are examples across the country. So for example, an example I'll use, the Shift Capital thing in Philly. So the north side of Philly is a lot like the north side and the east side, and you know, the types of places where, you know, particularly Black people in Philly, a very Black city, have been relegated to and disinvested in all the kind of things that you see in cities across the country. And there are, you know, private actors, philanthropic actors, buying up these resources, buying up these assets and putting them in community hands. And I think that that's the thing that like philanthropy, that private capital should be doing, in a way that there's ways to own, you know, multifamily real estate in ways that, you know, are not slumlorded, that support communities. There's ways to do, you know, and I know that we're going to hear from Neil and folks like that later, who are doing awesome work locally in St. Louis, awesome development work in St. Louis. But, you know, that there are ways to do this that aren't predatory, that aren't extractive. And I think that, you know, folks like Shift Capital and then the Kensington Corridor Trust, which is partly funded by the Ford Foundation, up there, are, you know, turning asset ownership into things that actually benefit the communities themselves and keep that capital in the community, as opposed to allowing it to leave.
So you talk about capital and community. Like, how do we model this to bring it together? Say if we wanted to have a cortex in North St. Louis, like how do we model that capital where it's us as Black people and minorities benefiting and controlling that narrative while the capital is working with and for us.
So I mean, that's the biggest challenge that you know that, but that is the single biggest challenge. And I think what it takes is the the benevolent capital, whatever, that's finally focused on impact or whatever, to realize that it shouldn't be their decision making. It shouldn't be in their hands what happens, right? So the idea that what I'm out here screaming about and banging the drum about is that if you are trying, and we've talked about this offline, is that if you're trying to allocate capital to these places, I want to invest X amount of money in the north side of St. Louis. I want to invest in the self-determination of Black communities in North St. Louis. Give them the capital, work with them to kind of realize their vision for what the community should look like, what a cortex for the north side of St. Louis should look like. It should be the folks that are, the North Stars, the partners, whatever it might be, of these communities, and then leveraging the expertise of the people who built, the cortex and, the near west side or whatever it is, right? Leveraging expertise, technical assistance, that capital, the most important part. But I think it should be all filtered through the kind of local community hands. But to directly answer your question, it's got to be up to the people allocating that capital to say, we want it to be up to you what you do with this capital. And, who knows whether that happens or not.
So how do we get policies changed? One of the biggest issues that we have is that some of the policies, unfortunately, even when you have community land trusts, they don't necessarily always work in a manner that helps the community, even though we try to design them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I know I asked
you. I don't know.
The question.
No. I mean, look, I think my understanding and the framework through which I look at this is that it's all about who owns these things, right? So to who controls the community trust and who decides what happens with those assets? Is it somebody who is trusted by the community to do that, right? And again, I don't know in certain places, I don't know in St. Louis, I don't want to speak to it, but I think that the idea that there are these assets need to be agglomerated, right? The idea that we should have control of these assets, and then we should be appointing people that have cultural competency, that have community trust, that have the understanding of the visions for example, the north side, to deploy them appropriately. And then the folks who are investing alongside, whether it's the city and that kind of policy, or whether it's private capital, should go along with that vision. And I think our role as an organization is to try to convene those people and have those conversations. Again, that was hard to do over the last year and a half because of the pandemic, but we're really optimistic and excited to be able to do so in person.
Well, I want to thank you for your time, for your insight. Learn something new every day. You give me a lot to think about, and we look forward to seeing you next week. And Accelerated for America, and of course, Mastercard is working in St. Louis, and the goal is to help us figure out some of the challenges that we have north. And I look forward to seeing you next week.
I appreciate you. I'll see you soon. Thank you.
So now we'll have our panel discussion. As we have talked about so many different things, now it's time to get the panel's view from a St. Louis perspective, since we are talking about inclusive growth, inclusive neighborhoods. I want to ask the panel to turn their cameras on and briefly introduce themselves. We'll start with Kevin, then Neil, Nikki, and then Esther. To briefly introduce yourselves, and who are you and what do you do?
Hi, my name is Kevin Bryant. I'm a developer. I'm working primarily in Fountain Park, a little bit of Lewis Place. So we touch about 207 acres on the north side of Del Mar. I can keep going.
I mean,
Go ahead,
I don't want to cut you off at all, Kevin.
No, sir, that's it. I'll yield to you. We'll get into it.
Thank you. Neil Richardson, the Executive Director of St. Louis Development Corporation, as well as one of the co-founders of Dream Builders for Equity. Executive Director of SLDC is really responsible for driving economic development growth for our entire city, and working with regional partners to do that on a more regional level. And a lot of the things that Aaron spoke to are priorities of us as we continue to drive economic development growth, specifically in our areas that have been underinvested historically.
Hi, I'm Nikki Wolfel with Carrollton Bank. The other hat I wear and why I'm here today is I'm one of the original framers, I guess, of the Gateway Neighborhood Fund, and a lot of people on here might know that under the name of the Greenlighting Fund. I saw a lot of my former or my steering committee members on this webinar today, so I'm happy to see that they're here, and happy to talk more about that in a bit.
Good afternoon. I am Esther Shin. I'm president of Urban Strategies. We're a national nonprofit whose corporate home is in St. Louis. We use housing to leverage social and economic investments to produce equitable outcomes for children and families so that they can move from stable to thriving.
Thank you all. As you see, we have a great panel today, and I really want to start with Esther. We talk about determining neighborhood values and what that means, not only to development, but to the residents. Can you talk more about how that plays a factor into our community, and then also talk about how that intertwines with the people that already live there?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for the question, Daphne. So obviously, my observations are based on the work that Urban Strategies has been doing, and I've been with the organization for going on almost 23 years. So this is 23 years of observation in a variety of roles. And when thinking about neighborhood values, what I've observed is that we oftentimes value transactions over transformation. And it is, it's a housing deal. It is building an infill unit. It is exchanging of dollars rather than focusing on people. And that's how revitalization has traditionally been done. And so hoping that, creating equitable outcomes, oftentimes, if you're in a community working, you're hoping that what you are trying to do aligns with a funder or a resource provider's goals. It is, if it fits your bottom line, maybe we'll be able to get something funded, right? So it's alignment across, it's misalignment really across differing agendas when talking about transforming communities. And for example, financial literacy. Financial literacy has gotten a lot of attention, and financial literacy is a good thing. But when I think upon my grad school days when I was broke, I could account for every penny in my bank account, right? So it seems like when you have less, you know where every penny exists. And the more that I started to make, the easier it was to lose track of where that money is. So there is this mental model and assumption that because you live in a low wealth community, that you don't know how to track your money.
Right.
And so a lot of resources being invested in financial literacy, and that's great, but how about a yes and using those dollars to invest in Black and brown businesses and turning around and transforming communities? How we even assess who creditors, investors lend to that formula. How do we shift that formula? Because really that formula is based on an assumption that is not always backed by data about what the financial capacity is of a certain zip code, which really translates to your skin color. And so a lot of how transactions get made and done in terms of neighborhood revitalization is based on white middle-class values, white supremacist values that's really focused on keeping resources within a certain population, with a certain group. And even when you talk about inclusion and neighborhood participation and power brokering, where we go to, who do we go to when we talk to residents, right? And even how we count what inclusion looks like, it is counting bodies, it's counting widgets and not impact. How many people showed up to a meeting? How many people participated in a certain activity? What about, there are parents in these communities that are volunteering in their children's schools. That's engagement, that's inclusion. How can we think about what inclusion looks like that's different in a community? I've attended one community meeting in my neighborhood in 16 years. And yet we measure things, we value things differently because we're talking about low wealth communities. And so these are values that are really largely based on mental models and biases that don't necessarily stem from real data.
Esther, that's good stuff. I'm going to ask each panelist a question, and then we'll start to dive in a little bit deeper. So Nikki, piggyback off of that is how we view our communities. Can you talk about appraisal gaps and how they limit the ability to establish an organic market in a neighborhood with low valuation?
Sure, thank you. And Esther, I have to give an amen on that financial literacy, because as in the banking industry, we do a lot of financial literacy. And I have thought for a long time, people that have limited income know how to manage that money better than anybody else, because you have to. So I appreciate you saying that. So the appraisal gap issue is something that I think a lot of people are talking about now, but I think over the last probably 4 or 5 years, as we've been working on just different opportunities to create a mortgage market in areas where we see limited mortgage market, and I would say in the St. Louis area, that's North City and North County, we've kind of put our hand on a lot of the different challenges that are created about why we're not seeing mortgage activity. And really, you can solve for a lot of challenges, and you can create down payment assistance programs and home buyer education programs, but there's still some challenges that are ever present that are just really insurmountable in some ways. And so several years ago, we were made aware of a Detroit program called the Detroit Home Mortgage Program, and it really just solved for that appraisal gap issue. And really what that means is, let's say you have a home for sale for $100,000 in a particular neighborhood, but that appraisal is only going to come in at $75,000. And so that requires that borrower to come up with $25,000 worth of cash. Well, there are very few borrowers in any income category that can come up with $25,000 worth of cash. But then when you're in a particularly depressed market and in an area where, because the appraisal gap exists, you probably have folks that are even less likely to be able to come up with that gap. And so what Detroit did was they created a mortgage market or a mortgage fund that solved for that. So rather than creating another down payment assistance program or another financial or home buyer education program, what they did was said, we're going to fund those mortgages, something that financial institutions can't do, because although we are bound by Community Reinvestment Act and we are bound to the obligations of the CRA, we are fully, first and foremost, bound by risk management, what used to be called safety and soundness. And so we can't make loans over the appraisal gap. We're not allowed to do that from a safety and soundness standpoint. And so the financial institutions and the nonprofits got together and said, well, let's solve for this. And so we did create kind of a secondary mortgage market fund to be able to cover that appraisal gap. So it gives people an opportunity to purchase homes where they want to purchase homes, regardless of what the market looks like. It also gives people an opportunity to create a home improvement fund if you already live in that neighborhood and you really want to improve your home. And these are all things that will have an impact on the ultimate appraisals and comparables in those neighborhoods, but it also allows people to stay and live where they want to stay and live, whether that's through home improvement on deferred maintenance or purchasing homes and staying in the neighborhood where they're renting and their kids go to school and they have family connections. And so the appraisal gap it's a very real issue. And what I will say is our program, as well as the Detroit program, it is a Band-Aid on a bigger issue. And we feel very strongly that we're working really hard to create an opportunity for folks. But the appraisal industry itself, it really needs to have a broader look. And we know that from a legislative standpoint, that is happening. We know that's happening in Washington, D.C. because we've been called. We've been called and asked for our assessment of the appraisal process and what that process looks like. And we think that there are larger changes that can happen. But in the meantime, what we've tried to do is create a program that will solve for that challenge, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to solve for all the challenges that keep getting thrown at us that create a depressed mortgage market.
All right, thank you. So Neil, we're talking about policy. So what is the correlation of the racial wealth gap with the lack of inclusive housing policies and priorities as you listen to what Nikki and Esther has just discussed.
Yeah, no, this is great. Thank you, Daphne, for the invitation. And I want to definitely give much kudos to Mastercard for putting on this event. And this is a very important topic. I think Aaron stole a lot of my thunder already as he spoke to a lot of the gaps that we're challenged with as it relates to communities of color, specifically the Black community. We all know that you may know that there's a racial wealth gap that's around 10-to-1 between Black and white households. A large majority of that is attributed to home ownership. Right now in the city of St. Louis, in the Black zip code, the average home value is 1/4 of that of a white zip code. And so as we think about the racial wealth gap and assets minus liabilities equal net worth, we know that there's not enough assets that are owned by Black communities and by Black people. And so what we have to have is clear interventions to address that. As Aaron spoke to earlier, I mean, he mentioned some of the policies and systematic racist policies and covenants that have been put in place that have prevented for people of color, but specifically Black families, to build wealth through home ownership. And in order for us to actually turn that tide, we need to have strong interventions, such as those that Nikki spoke to and those things that urban strategies are placing forward. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we have to talk about ownership. Ownership in the homes, ownerships in the neighborhoods, and ownerships in their future. And a lot of that is really built on how do we strategically provide capacity for these neighborhoods to elevate their voices of the residents and see the development that they want to realize in their communities. And that includes investing into neighborhood organizations and CDCs, such as the one that Kevin Bryant is leading in Fountain Park and Lewis Place, is really being able to convene those residents and responding to their needs to ensure that as we're developing these communities, as we're making investments, it's actually creating ownership for them. And creating opportunities for access to home ownership, access to those mortgages. And that's the focus, because if we don't have a clear intervention on how we're providing capital for those financing gaps or for the gaps in liquidity or net worth, then the compounding impact of that over generation, after generation, is a single widening of that gap. And that's what we've been continuing to see. And so we need to be intentional about how we address these historical barriers through policies such as what Esther spoke to around how are we underwriting the mortgages within our neighborhoods? How are we valuing those properties? Because the valuation of those properties ultimately determine how much capital and how much wealth is able to be accumulated by those residents and by those businesses and by those neighborhoods over time. So how do we create those ownership models for those assets and for that wealth to be fairly and equitably realized over time? And then that will ultimately drive greater values and greater appreciation in these Black and brown neighborhoods at large. And so what I want to see us do is take action on being very intentional of how we invest in ownership models for residents, for businesses, and for neighborhoods to really realize the economic values over time. And so that's the things that I really want us to focus on. And I'm excited to partner with Mastercard, with Aaron, and meeting you all next week to discuss further around how we really dismantle this divide once and for all, and ultimately build wealth across the entire region.
Thank you. Kevin, as you listen to all of this, I know your mind is like, it's a lot, right? As a developer, you're trying to create new housing, you're trying to create affordable housing, and you're also trying not to also bring amenities into the community. So how do you make this work when the cost of development is so high at this point, and you're trying to balance not displacing anyone, making housing affordable, and also being able to pay to get these development done?
Yeah, I think Aaron hit it on the head when it comes to untraditional ways of attracting money, attracting philanthropic money, civic private, any types of tools that you can use that are not traditionally used in this community are the tools that you're going to be dependent on. Because on my level as a developer, you're dealing with banks that really are not drinking the Kool-Aid. They're not wrapped up in the philosophy of our communities, and we're inheriting a lot of historic and systemic racism. In other words, when I approach a bank and I say, hey, I need $250,000 to build a house, which is the average cost now, they just want to know the ROI. They don't want to know if I went to a Black college, if it's historic. They just want to know how they ensure the investors if the money is coming back. So what I have to do is kind of hedge their bets by going after untraditional streams of money and trying and plug that into the cost of development. So for instance, traditionally, I've been able to use NPA tax credits, which is National Preservation Act, historics, and we're even working on a model for new markets right now. But those sort of things are the tools that I need when I'm going into building in a community that has suffered from decades of historic disinvestments, and you approach these communities from several levels. You approach them on a residential level where you really want to create home ownership, but then you're dealing with a low-income census tract. So how do we offset that? Then when you look at, all right, well, maybe we need some market rate houses over here to help stabilize the valuations across the board, then you have to be careful not to gentrify a neighborhood. And gentrification comes just if there's 2 homes left on the block and you're doing an infill of 8, technically you've gentrified. Now you haven't displaced, but all those housing prices and valuations just went up, and those 2 homeowners that were there, probably seniors, you have to prepare them for those rising costs, because then you may not be able to, they may not, through no direct intention of yours, may not be able to stay in those communities and age in place.
Okay, so you've mentioned a little bit about displacement, and I want to dive a little deeper into that. Trying to redevelop a community is hard. Trying to keep people in their community is even harder depending on income. And as we try to redevelop communities, my question is there a way, and maybe Esther and Neil, you can kind of talk about this, a way that we build those models for mixed income and somehow try to ensure that displacement doesn't happen? Because normally we know displacement is coming, and to stop it it's kind of complex.
So I can be the first to respond. There is a way to do revitalization responsibly. And I think that, one, there has to be transparency and real clarity around what the non-negotiables are. So not making promises that just can't be kept, right? So full transparency and clarity around communication with community every step of the way, around timelines, things that you don't know, things that we just don't know because we can't look to the future. 2, it's really quick and easy to build a building. It's much harder to move a family right closer to thriving. And so there has to be a significant focus on the human capital needs of community. And Daphne, you raised mixed income, and mixed income provides a great opportunity to be able to ladder a family, right? To provide multiple kinds of opportunities in a community while also keeping residents in their neighborhoods and in their homes. And if you think about traditional intact communities that were successful, they were mixed income, right? There were opportunities for seniors, families that are just starting out, young professionals. And, so mixed income is a great financial model and tool to be able to provide laddering opportunities. But I can't stress enough how important those human capital investments are so that families are not left behind and they have those opportunities so that they can actually use those laddering financial tools.
I just want to piggyback on exactly what Esther stated as an investment in human capital, which includes an investment into the workforce of those communities, making sure that they have the necessary technical support and access to those jobs. And that's why we have to look at this development, not just being solely focused on home ownership, but look at the whole community around what are the jobs that we're creating. What is the type of amenities that are being had or developed in these communities? What type of jobs are being created, the wages of those jobs, and create access to those living and thriving wage jobs within these low to moderate income communities. So as the community begins to grow over time, the access to those jobs and resources, the human capital, the investment there, actually they're able to grow too. I think gentrification ultimately happens when the market outperforms the ability of the wages of the residents in that community. And so if we're able to continue to invest into the human capital and provide opportunities for those families to have access to living and thriving wage jobs as these communities begin and continue to increase, that they will continue to increase in wealth over time. The goal should not be to lower the bar, but it should be providing the necessary access to raise the opportunities and raise the talent for those families, because that's how long-term wealth will ultimately be built. But I think also we have to be focused on some of the families that are on fixed incomes, as Kevin spoke to, some of the elders. I know he has a lot of elders in his community and seniors that need support with home repairs, that need support with their increase in tax values and assessments that they have to pay as well. So it's having those clear interventions and knowledge. So when we are developing these communities, we're having conversations with the philanthropic industry, the government officials to say, we want to do development here, but we also want to do it in a responsible manner. So we need to have the necessary funding to support for these seniors to stay in place and other low-income people to stay in place and realize that value, because if not, that wealth that has been created by those seniors during their time period will not be passed down in the most effective way. And that's how wealth is lost. And we cannot afford for the wealth that is there to be lost from generation to generation. We must ensure that that continues to compound over time. And so that's how I see us really addressing that gap in a significant way through holistic economic and community development.
Thank you. So Kevin and Nikki, Kevin, how can you talk about some of your outreach to the community and how you have tried to work with the community? And Nikki, how do you all promote the program that you all are doing through community outreach?
I'll go first, Nikki. So I was actually going to add that on to what Neil and Esther said. When we started planning this development, we spent the first 2 years just creating a housing board, trying to create a vehicle by which the community can participate. So by not being a top-down developer and a developer that kind of came from the grassroots up, it allowed me to have this relationship with the community that I wanted to be informed. So that's the first thing we did. Then we knew with the senior population being so high, we wanted to create a sort of grant system to help them with everything from rising taxes to tax abatement if they were making improvements on their homes. And ultimately, we created a partnership with Rebuilding Together, which gave up to $25,000 worth of free home repair. So all of these things were different tools that we created internally to make the residential model work. And then externally, we got really lucky in that our corridor was Del Mar. So we play in a commercial district, which is going to create an additional tax revenue that's going into that community, whereas they had none for the past 20 or 30 years. And it's modeled all the way down to our apartment building. So we're building a 200-unit market rate apartment building. That's about a $50 million construction. 2% of the sale of that apartment building will go directly into this community. And I don't even know any other developers that's doing that. But that percentage is going directly into the community to help stabilize what's happening north of Del Mar.
So I'll talk a little bit about our outreach and how we're, so we're specifically targeting 2 geographies, and that was by design based on some advice from appraisers and how appraisals create comps or pull comps for their purposes. And so what we did is we clustered 4 neighborhoods in 2 different parts of the city. And so we have 4 neighborhoods in kind of the West Central, as 4 neighborhoods in the north part of the city. And so our outreach includes both SLACO and then those in those neighborhood organizations that are operating in those particular neighborhoods. And that's not to say that we wouldn't have loans that come to us to the fund outside of our target area, but we know that clustering properties is really where you're going to have the most impact. And so our board of managers and the members of our steering committee do some outreach, but it really falls on Randon Click, who is our housing coordinator through the Gateway Neighborhood Fund, and he's an employee of Justine Peterson. And then we've employed SLACO to help us do outreach as well. And when we did our kickoff in the Baden neighborhood in May, boy, that feels like it was more than 2 months ago, but it was back in May, and immediately began receiving inquiries into the program, more than we could have ever hoped for. So we know that when you specifically focus on areas, neighborhoods, leaders and community members in those neighborhoods, we know that people are thirsty for this kind of program, and that has really shown itself through our outreach.
Okay, and anyone can answer the next few questions. So how do we address the misconception of the risk related with appraisal gaps in Black and Brown neighborhoods? Because we know that that's really the biggest issue. And sometimes it's not even if you're in a Black or Brown neighborhood, sometimes it is just because of your race, that even if you're in a high level income area, that you're still going to get a lower appraisal. Anyone want to take a stab?
So I'll just mention a little bit about that regulatory and legislative process that's been kind of happening. We had no control over it whatsoever. That's what I'll say. And I will say, if anybody's ever attended a Fed or FDIC webinar, you know that we always say, these are my personal views. These are not the views of my organization. So I am sharing my personal views, but I do feel like the appraisal industry is kind of the last industry that really hasn't had the scrutiny that maybe the banking industry has, the real estate industry has had over the years, and really enacted some changes. But this was really the last piece of the puzzle for us, is that appraisal industry. And so we do know that you mentioned the risks or the perceived risks. That factors into the appraisal value. And as a financial institution, we have zero control over how an appraisal is really, that information is gathered. But I think what we're trying to do is create, as I said, a Band-Aid on a bigger issue, but we know that issue is being looked at. We've had senators and we've had representatives call us and ask us about this program. We know that the appraisal gap is a problem in almost every urban metropolitan area in the United States. So we know that this is on the radar, and we think now is the time where there's action happening. And so we're hoping from a legislative standpoint that maybe some regulatory oversight will ultimately put our program out of business, because it will no longer be necessary.
Thank you.
Critical, important point. I'm sorry, Daphne.
No,
I was just going to say that's a critically important point that Nikki made, because those appraisals ultimately determine the future of those neighborhoods and the future of those homeowners, because that really dictates how much wealth do you have available. Again, as I talked about, net wealth is a simple equation. It's asset minus liabilities, and if your assets that you have on north of Delmar is undervalued compared to those in south of Delmar, then obviously the access to opportunity, the access to capital, the access to really to even have quality education or even pursue post-secondary education opportunities, it's limited. It's less available to you. And that's what we talk about when we're trying to break down this divide, is being able to push policies, being able to push appraisers, not to just look within a small radius, but look at a wider radius of the values and the opportunities that can be created in those neighborhoods, because that is, as Nikki said, probably one of the last frontiers that we need to hit on and really make sure that the valuation of those houses and other assets in those communities are being assessed in the most appropriate way.
Okay.
And I'll just add, I'm sorry, Daphne, I just wanted to add that we've had to be very strategic about it. So we knew when we started, economies of scale was everything. So we didn't rely upon the existing valuations. We knew we had to take out a certain amount of homes, a minimum of 4, and redevelop those at the same time. That way the appraisals pull from each other and we can kind of control what those valuations are. And then that led to us trying to buy and stabilize all of the vacant and derelict properties around Fountain Park, just because those were the properties that were bringing the values down. So it took a forward-thinking investment for the future. Like we know it won't be an immediate return for us, but because we're not in it to make an immediate profit and we're really not profit-driven, the first couple of years was just buying the vacant and derelict properties, stabilizing them, and then bringing to market the first minimum of 4. That way we can pull from those appraisals and move the community forward.
Okay. So we know that some gentrification is unavoidable. So when we think about areas like the Grove, the Manchester area, can we talk about how some of these high-end housing that we're starting to see in our communities, even in some of the neighborhoods that are transitioning faster than north, how do we balance that? Can you speak on the pros and cons of, you want the high end, you want to see some of the vacant area or infill developed, but then there's a cost, right? You know that gentrification is coming.
So Daphne,
well, I'm sorry, Esther, go ahead.
I think that the response is somewhat similar to the question around displacement. I mean, the reality of it is that everyone wants to live in a safe neighborhood, but the second that you start making a neighborhood safer, you're moving towards gentrification. Everyone wants better schools in their communities, and the minute you have a better school in your community, you're starting to march towards gentrification. So it's this balancing between investing in people and investing in the bricks and mortar of a community. It's as Neil talked about, it's investing in workforce, it's investing in cradle to college career opportunities, it is investing in health services, it's investing in all the human capital things that will prepare families for the path towards gentrification.
Do you think that any of the violations that have happened around gentrification, low appraisal values, that the city or CREA could get more involved in, Esther?
Oh, absolutely. And so, there is obviously gentrification that happens over time because your neighborhood improves, because things like public safety and better schools. Then there's gentrification that happens because quite frankly, developers or municipalities that just don't care, right? And are wanting to invest in a community for a whole host of reasons, whether it's to clear sites for, high-end market rate condos or, whatnot. So it is, obviously that's the extreme that we need to avoid. And so that is where capacity in a municipality is extremely important, and having a real clear vision for communities. It is as someone said earlier, investing in local neighborhood organizations that can really partner with resources, municipalities, funders, and lending institutions, so that these kinds of whole-scale dramatic gentrification possibilities don't happen.
Okay, so everybody wants to know about the money. So Neil, I'm going to pose a question to you. Right now we have the American Rescue funding that's coming to St. Louis, and everyone wants to figure out what is the best and highest use to use them. SLDC will be receiving some funding, and you've had some great ideas around a social justice fund and how that can be used. Can you talk more about that piece of it?
You see me smiling because I get excited when you talk about having resources to actually do some of this work. But as I spoke to earlier, really being able to address the historical barriers and close those gaps, it requires us to be intentional with how we invest those dollars, specifically if they're grant dollars. That are coming to help spark investment in our historically underinvested and marginalized communities. And again, I want to focus on the capacity building of those neighborhood organizations, right? And so being able to clearly respond to the direct needs of the residents, of the businesses, of that community, having a convening body, having a voice that represents the community is desperately necessary as the private and public sector are looking to work together to address these needs of these communities. Understanding what are the home challenges, what are the business challenges, and for us not to make assumptions, but for us to be able to directly respond to the needs of those residents, of those businesses specifically. And so that's why I believe investment into these neighborhood organizations, these community development corporations are very needed. And we should be prioritizing that because it helps us provide a direct relief in a more efficient and effective and equitable manner. But then also for us to think about the future of how do we, again, focus on workforce development, ensuring that the residents, the youth within that community have access to quality jobs, ensuring that the businesses that are within these neighborhoods as well have access to affordable capital in order for them to sustain, grow, and employ the residents within those neighborhoods as well. And it's really centered around ownership. Again, is how do we make sure that those neighborhoods have the necessary ownership of their assets and ownership of their narrative in order to shape what they want to see and shape the type of investment that they want to realize. I think Aaron spoke to it earlier around we have to create opportunities for investment to be placed in neighborhoods for them to make decisions and then for them to hold themselves accountable to themselves and for us to really get out of the way. So it's for us to invest into these areas and allow them to make their dreams become realized or their visions to become realized. But again, it's focused on ownership. It's focused on building that financial equity through workforce development, through business empowerment, and ultimately in creating holistic development models to stabilize and revitalize those neighborhoods in a more immediate way to ultimately spark that private and other investment that's needed in order to create that long-term economic growth.
Okay. And final question, I think I want Esther to answer this because it deals with community benefits agreements. And I know that you've probably dealt with this. Like, how do we balance the people and the places as far as you want great development coming to your neighborhood, but you also want to make sure that the people are taken care of. And a lot of people like community benefits agreements. I'm a little 50-50 on if they really work the way they're supposed to. But can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I would agree. I think, CBAs are a great way to document a partnership. At the end of the day, whether you're a developer or a municipality, your number one partner should be the residents living in the community. And so there have to be opportunities that are created that provide real economic opportunities for the families that live there. And so the number one expert and consultant should be the residents of the neighborhood. So it's creating those opportunities for them to have real voice. So they're not just a passive participant, which is oftentimes what I've seen in communities is creating passive opportunities, but really creating active opportunities that show up in multiple ways and being creative about it so that if one method doesn't work, it is exhausting all of them. And I don't think that there is such a thing as an endless amount of ways to engage residents. So whether it's formalized through something like a CBA, at the end of the day, any revitalization has to have residents at the center of it and really an actual true partnership that results in equitable outcomes for the people that live in those communities.
Thank you. I want to thank this great panel. This was a great discussion. I know we ran out of time, but because the social policy at WashU and Mastercard and this committee, we're going to continue this conversation. So this conversation will continue. You have tomorrow as well. So I'm going to turn it over now to Salah to to take it back over, and thank you again for having me as your moderator.
Thank you, Daphne. And thank you to all of the great speakers that we had today. It's clear just from sitting here and listening, there's a lot of work going on, but it's clear we also have a lot to do still, but that there's really smart and passionate people working on the ideas to make the neighborhood, inclusive neighborhood investments a reality for all of us, especially for the people who will benefit from it, the residents of St. Louis. We heard a few ideas about what's needed to support inclusive neighborhoods that don't displace people from today's speakers, but we'll continue the conversation tomorrow, as Daphne said. And tomorrow, our panel will focus on outcomes based on investments in small and minority-owned businesses, and particularly in underserved neighborhoods. And I'm excited to remind everyone that we'll close out the day with remarks from Mayor Tashara Jones. So we hope you'll join us again tomorrow, same time, for that discussion. We're going to send around all the participants a follow-up email with today's recording soon, so you have it. And also, please use the link in the chat to share quick feedback so that we can continue to create these kind of conversations that we want to make sure continue to be relevant and engaging going forward in the future. So I want to end by thanking you again and saying that we will see you tomorrow. Bye, everyone.